The silence in Mrs. Gable's life had become a constant, a soft hum beneath the surface of her days that had once been filled with the boisterous laughter of her late husband, Arthur. Arthur, a man whose booming voice could fill a room and whose presence was as solid as the oak trees in her backyard, had been gone for 3 years, leaving behind a void that even the most vibrant of flowers in her meticulously tended garden couldn't quite fill. Her days were now a quiet ballet of watering, weeding, and the occasional, meticulously planned grocery run. Her home, once a hub of activity, now echoed with the phantom footsteps of a life lived fully, a life that had abruptly ended. Her neighbor, Mr. Silas Blackwood, had become an unexpected anchor in her solitary existence. Silas lived in the tidy blue craftsman bungalow directly across the street, a house that always seemed to emanate an aura of quiet order. He was a man of few words, his days seemingly as predictable as the sunrise. He was a widower, a fact he'd shared with Mrs. Gable in a hushed, understated tone during one of their infrequent porch encounters. He'd mentioned his wife, Eleanor, with a gentle sadness that resonated deeply with Mrs. Gable's own grief. They had spoken, in those early days of shared widowhood, of the peculiar emptiness that settled in the bones, the way familiar objects could suddenly ache with absence. Silas had a way of listening, of offering a small, understanding nod that spoke volumes. He'd bring over a bag of his prize-winning tomatoes or a jar of his homemade plum jam, small gestures that carved out little pockets of connection in Mrs. Gable's otherwise isolated world. He was a man of routine, Silas. Every Tuesday and Friday, precisely at 7:30 a.m., his faded green sedan would pull out of his driveway, and he'd disappear for the day, presumably to his work as an accountant, a profession Mrs. Gable imagined involved neat columns of numbers and quiet concentration. He'd return in the late afternoon, and often she'd see him on his porch, reading a thick book, his brow furrowed in concentration. On Saturdays, he'd be out in his garden, his movements slow and deliberate, tending to his own patch of green with a care that mirrored her own. He was, in short, the picture of quiet, respectable widowerhood. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose own life had been a tapestry woven with vibrant threads of community involvement and social gatherings, found a strange comfort in Silas's predictable rhythm. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic flux of her own past, a past that now felt like a dream she'd once inhabited. She'd often watch him from her bay window, a gentle smile gracing her lips. He was a good man, she'd tell herself, a man who understood the quiet dignity of loss. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves outside her window began their fiery descent, Mrs. Gable was arranging a bouquet of late-blooming dahlias when she heard a faint, unfamiliar sound. It was the clinking of keys, the soft thud of a car door closing. But it wasn't Silas's usual sedan. Curiosity, a feeling that had been dormant for too long, stirred within her. She walked to the front door, peering through the beveled glass pane. A sleek black SUV, a model far more luxurious than Silas's familiar vehicle, was parked in his driveway. The engine idled with a low, sophisticated purr. Then the driver's side door opened, and Silas emerged, but he wasn't dressed in his usual tweed jacket and sensible slacks. He was wearing a sharply tailored suit, the kind that spoke of important meetings and expensive tailoring. His hair, usually a neat silver thatch, was slicked back, and he carried a small, expensive-looking leather briefcase. He looked different, sharper, a man with a purpose that seemed to extend beyond the quiet confines of their suburban street. Then, the passenger door opened, and Mrs. Gable's breath hitched. A woman stepped out. She was tall, with a cascade of dark, glossy hair that fell past her shoulders. She was wearing a vibrant emerald green dress that hugged her figure in a way that was both elegant and undeniably striking. Her makeup was subtle but expertly applied, highlighting high cheekbones and a confident smile. She moved with a grace that was almost theatrical, her heels clicking softly on the asphalt. Mrs. Gable's heart gave a peculiar lurch. This was not the Eleanor Silas had spoken of. Eleanor he'd described as a woman with kind eyes and a gentle spirit, a woman who preferred gardening to glamour. This woman was a vision, a creature of a different world. Silas turned to her, his face animated in a way Mrs. Gable had never seen. He reached out, not with the hesitant touch of a grieving widower, but with a confident, possessive gesture, and took the woman's hand. And then, in a movement that seemed to freeze the very air around Mrs. Gable, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a chaste peck on the cheek, or a friendly embrace. It was a kiss that spoke of intimacy, of passion, of a connection that was undeniably romantic. It was a kiss that sent a tremor through Mrs. Gable, a tremor that was part shock, part confusion, and a surprising, unsettling pang of something that felt suspiciously like betrayal. The woman laughed, a light, musical sound that carried on the autumn breeze. Silas smiled, a broad, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He said something to her, and she nodded, her hand still clasped in his. They walked together towards his front door, their bodies moving in an easy, synchronized rhythm. Mrs. Gable stood frozen in her doorway, the dahlias forgotten in her hands. The carefully constructed image of Silas Blackwood, the quiet, grieving widower, shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. The silence in her own home suddenly felt heavier, more profound, as the quiet predictability of her neighbor's life had just been revealed as a carefully constructed facade. The question that echoed in the sudden, deafening quiet of her mind was simple, yet seismic. Who was Silas Blackwood? And who was the woman in the emerald green dress? The predictable rhythm of her own days had just been irrevocably disrupted. The kiss, brief and fervent, felt like a seismic jolt that rippled through the sterile, impersonal expanse of the airport concourse. Mrs. Gable, frozen behind a potted ficus, felt her carefully constructed composure crumble like dry earth. The woman, her emerald dress a slash of vibrant color against the muted tones of travel, had been swept into Silas's embrace with an ease that spoke of practiced intimacy. It wasn't the chaste peck one might offer a distant acquaintance. It was a claiming, a declaration. Her mind, usually so adept at cataloging the minutiae of her garden and the precise brewing time for her chamomile tea, raced now, a chaotic flux of fragmented images and unanswered questions. Silas. Her. Silas, the man who meticulously pruned his rose bushes with Arthur's old shears, the man whose solitary existence had seemed to mirror her own quiet widowhood, the man who had, in his own understated way, become an unexpected anchor in the vast, often terrifying sea of her grief, the SUV. It had been an anomaly, a gleaming obsidian beast that had materialized from the mundane suburban landscape as if conjured by a magician's wand. She'd dismissed it as a momentary lapse, perhaps a rental for a visiting relative, a fleeting extravagance. But the man emerging from its driver's seat, the sharply tailored suit, the silver thatch of hair impeccably styled, the air of confident purpose, that was not the Silas she knew. That was a different Silas altogether, a Silas who commanded attention, who moved with a grace that belonged on a stage, not weeding petunias. And then, the woman in emerald. She was a vision. Her hair, a cascade of dark waves, framed a face that was both striking and sophisticated. Her eyes, even from Mrs. Gable's vantage point, seemed to hold a knowing sparkle, and the smile she offered Silas was one of pure, unadulterated delight. They spoke, their voices a low murmur lost to the ambient hum of the airport, but their body language was a loud, clear narrative. The way Silas's hand rested possessively on the small of her back, the way her fingers tangled in his lapel. It was a language of shared history, of deep affection. Mrs. Gable felt a peculiar emptiness bloom in her chest, a hollow ache that had nothing to do with Arthur and everything to do with the man standing before her. She had built a narrative around Silas, a quiet, comforting story of shared loss and gentle companionship. He was the steady presence, the fellow traveler on the solitary road of widowhood. She had woven him into the tapestry of her days, a familiar, dependable thread. Now that tapestry felt ripped. The vibrant threads of this other life, this glamorous, passionate life, starkly, unforgivably absent from her perception. She watched, a silent observer in a drama she hadn't known existed, as Silas and the woman turned, their steps in perfect sync, and disappeared into the throng of travelers. The emerald dress was the last thing she saw, a receding beacon of a world utterly alien to her own. The airport, moments before a place of mild curiosity, now felt charged with a potent, almost illicit energy. The air, thick with the scent of jet fuel and stale coffee, seemed to hum with unspoken secrets. Mrs. Gable's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She felt a desperate urge to turn and flee, to retreat to the sanctuary of her meticulously ordered home, to pretend she hadn't seen. But her feet, as if rooted to the spot, refused to obey. She needed to understand. The need was primal, overwhelming. Who was this woman? What was her connection to Silas? Was this a brief, illicit rendezvous or something more profound? The questions swirled like a miniature tempest within her, each one a sharp shard of glass. Her gaze drifted back to the spot where they had stood. A single, discarded boarding pass lay on the polished floor, a forgotten fragment of their hurried departure. She hesitated, then, with a furtive glance around, stooped to retrieve it. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed the paper. The destination printed there was a city she'd only ever seen on travel brochures, a place of sun-drenched beaches and vibrant nightlife. Not the quiet, predictable locale where Silas Blackwood supposedly lived out his days. Clutching the boarding pass, she backed away from the ficus, her movements stiff and unnatural. She needed to get home. The quiet of her own house, the familiar scent of lavender and old books, felt like a distant, unattainable paradise. The journey back felt surreal. She found herself scrutinizing every passing face, every couple walking hand in hand, half expecting to see Silas's silver-thatched head or the flash of emerald green. The world outside her car window, once a comforting panorama of suburban normalcy, now seemed to teem with hidden possibilities, with lives lived just beneath the surface of what was visible. Arriving back at her quiet street, the familiar sight of her own tidy bungalow, the neatly trimmed lawn, the cheerful petunias in their window boxes, offered a strange, unsettling comfort. It was a world she understood, a world of predictable rhythms, but the knowledge she carried felt like a foreign object, an unwelcome intruder. She parked her car and walked up her driveway, the crunch of gravel beneath her sensible shoes a familiar sound. As she approached her front door, she glanced, almost involuntarily, toward Silas's house. It sat there, as it always did, a picture of quiet respectability. No SUV in the driveway, no sound of boisterous laughter, just the same hushed, understated air. It was as if the events at the airport had been a dream, a hallucination born of stale airport air and an overactive imagination. But the boarding pass, still clutched in her hand, was undeniably real. And the image of Silas, his face alight with a passion she had never witnessed, was seared into her memory. She let herself into her house, the silence a familiar companion. But now it felt different. It was no longer a gentle melancholy. It was a vast, echoing emptiness. She walked into her living room. the room where she and Arthur had spent so many evenings, the room that held so many memories. She looked at the photograph of Arthur on the mantelpiece, his kind eyes smiling out at her. Arthur, who had loved her with a steady, unwavering devotion. Arthur, who had never given her reason to doubt. She sank onto the plush velvet armchair, the boarding pass still in her hand. The carefully constructed image of Silas Blackwood, the grieving widower, had shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. What remained was an enigma, a man with a life so far removed from her own that she wondered if she had ever truly known him at all. The days that followed were a blur of quiet routine, punctuated by moments of intense, gnawing curiosity. Mrs. Gable found herself watching Silas's house with a new intensity. Every car that pulled into his driveway, every shadow that moved behind his beveled glass pane sent a jolt of anticipation through her. She saw him, of course. He continued his meticulous gardening, his quiet walks, his predictable visits to the local grocery store. He offered her a polite nod, a brief, almost shy smile, the same Silas she had always known. But now, every interaction was tinged with her secret knowledge. When he spoke of his late wife, Eleanor, her voice a mere whisper in their brief exchanges, Mrs. Gable found herself searching his eyes for some flicker of the man she had seen at the airport. Was he grieving Eleanor, or was he mourning the loss of a different kind of love? A love that had been rekindled in the emerald glow of an airport concourse. She confessed her sighting to no one. Who would believe her? Mrs. Gable, the quiet widow, the pillar of her small community, witnessing a clandestine rendezvous at the airport? It sounded like the plot of a cheap paperback novel. Besides, she felt a strange sense of protectiveness, an unspoken agreement to keep Silas's secret, even as it gnawed at her own peace of mind. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Mrs. Gable was tending to her late-blooming chrysanthemums, she saw it. A sleek black SUV, identical to the one she had seen before, pulled into Silas's driveway. Her heart leaped into her throat. She straightened slowly, her trowel falling forgotten to the damp earth. She watched, her breath catching in her chest, as Silas emerged. He was dressed in a dark suit, a stark contrast to his usual casual attire. He looked younger, more vibrant, the lines of quiet sorrow around his eyes softened by an unmistakable eagerness. He didn't go inside. Instead, he stood by the open door of the SUV, scanning the street. Mrs. Gable instinctively ducked behind a large rhododendron bush, her face hot with a mixture of shame and an irresistible pull of curiosity. Then, she saw her. The woman in the emerald green dress. She emerged from the passenger side of the SUV, a vision of effortless glamour even in the mundane setting of a suburban driveway. She carried a small, elegant overnight bag, and her smile, directed at Silas, was radiant. Mrs. Gable watched, mesmerized as they greeted each other, not with a hurried kiss this time, but with a warm, lingering embrace. Silas's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. Her fingers traced the lapel of his suit jacket. The intimacy was palpable, a silent conversation of shared affection and anticipation. They spoke for a few moments, their voices too low for Mrs. Gable to discern, but their body language spoke volumes. There was laughter, a shared glance that held a universe of understanding, a gentle touch of hands. It was clear to Mrs. Gable's astonished eyes that this was not a fleeting encounter. This was a pattern. This was a life lived in parallel, a vibrant counterpoint to the quiet existence she had assumed was Silas's entire world. Silas opened the passenger door for the woman, and then, with a final, lingering look, they both climbed into the SUV. The engine purred to life, a sophisticated sound that seemed to carry an air of adventure. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Mrs. Gable remained hidden behind the rhododendron, her mind reeling. She had thought Silas was a widower, a man finding solace in shared silence and predictable routines. She had seen him kiss a woman at the airport and had been jolted into a state of disbelief. Now, she had seen him again, with the same woman, in the same opulent vehicle, engaging in a display of affection that left no room for doubt. This was not a secret dalliance. It was a relationship. A significant, ongoing relationship. The carefully constructed facade, the image of the lonely widower, had not just been cracked, it had been definitively dismantled. Silas Blackwood was not merely a neighbor, he was a man with a hidden life, a life that pulsed with a vibrancy and passion that Mrs. Gable, in her own quiet way, had only ever dreamed of. As the taillights of the SUV disappeared down the street, Mrs. Gable finally emerged from her hiding place. The autumn air felt cooler now, the setting sun casting long shadows across her lawn. She looked at her house, her garden, her life. They were still the same, orderly and predictable. But she was not. The encounter had irrevocably altered her perception, not just of Silas, but of the very nature of truth and the hidden depths that lay beneath the calm surfaces of ordinary lives. The mystery of Silas Blackwood remained, but now it was no longer a question of if he had a secret, but who he truly was, and what other hidden worlds lay waiting to be discovered, just beyond the quiet confines of her own. The image of Silas Blackwood, my quiet, unassuming neighbor, locking lips with a woman who exuded a vibrant, almost defiant glamour, was a seismic shift in the carefully constructed landscape of my understanding. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a pronouncement, a bold declaration of a life I had never suspected existed, a life that seemed utterly at odds with the man who meticulously pruned his roses and offered me polite, if somewhat distant nods across the manicured lawns. Back in the sanctuary of my own home, the afternoon sun, usually a source of gentle warmth, felt intrusive, too bright for the dimming of my assumptions. I made myself a cup of tea, the familiar ritual a small anchor in the swirling confusion. The clinking of the spoon against the ceramic mug was a stark contrast to the sophisticated purr of the black SUV, the hushed intensity of their conversation as they'd emerged, and the undeniable passion of that embrace. It was a scene from a different film entirely, one where the protagonist wasn't a solitary figure tending to a quiet garden, but a man with secrets, with a life lived in vibrant, unexpected hues. My mind, accustomed to the predictable rhythm of my days, struggled to reconcile the two Silases. There was the Silas who had spoken of his late wife, Eleanor, with a gentle reverence, painting her as a woman of quiet domesticity, her world confined to the nurturing of their home and garden. He'd described her with a tenderness that had struck me as genuine, a testament to a love that had endured and now, in its absence, left a palpable void. He'd spoken of his own grief as a quiet, persistent ache, a shadow that clung to him like the scent of damp earth after a spring rain. He was, in my mind, a man etched in muted tones of loss and remembrance. But the man at the airport? He was a creature of sharp contrasts and bold strokes. The way he'd held the woman, the possessive gesture of his hand on her waist, the sheer, uninhibited joy that had radiated from them both. It was a language I hadn't heard him speak. And the woman herself, she was a masterpiece. Her emerald green dress, a fearless slash of color against the utilitarian grays and blues of airport travelers, had clung to her like a second skin. Her laughter, when she'd leaned in to whisper something in his ear, had been a cascade of bright, clear notes, a sound entirely alien to the hushed, understated tone I associated with Silas. Her hair, a cascade of dark waves, framed a face that was both striking and sophisticated. She was, quite frankly, magnificent. I found myself replaying the scene with an almost obsessive focus, dissecting every detail, the way Silas had looked at her, a look that held a mixture of adoration and something akin to reckless abandon. It was a look of a man utterly captivated, a man who, for those fleeting moments, had shed the mantle of the grieving widower and embraced a different persona entirely. And the kiss itself. It wasn't a chaste peck of farewell, but a deep, lingering connection, a silent conversation that spoke volumes. My heart had stuttered, not from fear, but from sheer, unadulterated surprise. The following days, my gaze lingered on Silas's house with a new intensity. I'd find myself peering through the beveled glass pane of my kitchen window, my tea growing cold as I waited for any sign of him. The predictable rhythm of his comings and goings, once a source of comfort, now felt like a carefully orchestrated performance. When he emerged, he was always the same Silas, immaculately dressed, his silver thatch neatly combed, his expression polite and reserved. He'd tend to his garden with the same meticulous care, his movements economical and precise. Yet beneath that placid surface, I now sensed an ocean of unspoken stories, a hidden current of passion and romance that had been entirely invisible to me. One afternoon, I was weeding my petunias, the familiar scent of damp soil filling the air, when I heard the distinctive roar of an engine. It was a sound far more powerful, more luxurious than the sensible sedan Silas usually drove. My head snapped up. There, pulling into his driveway, was the black SUV. My breath hitched. It was the same vehicle I'd seen him in with the woman in the emerald green dress. A tremor ran through me, a mixture of apprehension and a strange, almost illicit excitement. Silas emerged from the driver's side, and for a moment, he was just Silas, the neighbor. Then the passenger door opened, and she stepped out. The emerald green dress was gone, replaced by a chic charcoal gray pantsuit that accentuated her slender frame. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and she carried herself with an effortless grace that was captivating. She didn't look like a woman who belonged in our quiet suburban street. She looked like she belonged on a magazine cover, or at a glamorous gala. They stood for a moment by the car, not speaking. But their proximity suggested an intimacy that went beyond mere acquaintance. Silas reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, a gesture so fleeting, so understated, that most would have missed it. But I saw it. And then he leaned in, not for a kiss this time, but to say something close to her ear. Her response was a soft, melodic laugh, a sound that echoed in the quiet afternoon air. My weeding forgotten, I retreated to the relative privacy of my porch swing, my eyes fixed on their every move. They walked towards his front door, Silas's arm now resting casually on the small of her back. It was a gesture that spoke of familiarity, of comfort, of a relationship that was clearly well established. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness. They belonged together, at least in this context, in this private world that was unfolding before me. I watched as they disappeared inside his house. The silence that descended afterward was profound, broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of traffic. It was a silence that felt different now, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of Silas's hidden life. Who was this woman? Was she a friend, a colleague, or something more? The question of her identity gnawed at me, a persistent itch I couldn't quite scratch. Later that evening, as dusk began to paint the sky in hues of lavender and rose, I saw movement at Silas's windows. Lights flickered on, casting warm pools onto the lawn. I imagined them inside, perhaps sharing a meal. Their conversation flowing easily, punctuated by laughter. I pictured him pouring her a glass of wine, his gaze softened by an affection I had never witnessed. The mental images were vivid, almost intrusive, yet I couldn't tear myself away from the fascination. The carefully constructed image of Silas Blackwood, the grieving widower, had not just been challenged, it had been dismantled, brick by meticulous brick. He was a man of layers, of depths I hadn't even begun to fathom. The quiet reserve, the polite nods, the meticulous gardening, were these the carefully curated elements of a persona designed to conceal a more vibrant, more complex reality? The thought was both unsettling and undeniably intriguing. I found myself replaying our few conversations, searching for clues I might have missed. Had there been subtle hints, fleeting expressions that I had overlooked in my own quiet grief? Had I projected my own need for predictable companionship onto him, blinding myself to the possibility of a life beyond the one he presented? The answer, I suspected, was yes. I had seen what I expected to see, a reflection of my own solitary existence mirrored in his perceived loneliness. The next morning, the black SUV was gone. Silas's house was quiet, the curtains drawn. It was as if the previous day's events had been a dream, a fleeting hallucination. But the memory was too potent, too real, to be dismissed so easily. The image of Silas and the woman, their easy intimacy, their shared laughter, was seared into my mind. I realized then that my perception of Silas, and perhaps of many people in our quiet neighborhood, had been superficial. We lived in close proximity, yet we remained largely strangers, content to maintain polite distances, to inhabit our own carefully constructed worlds. We saw the surface, the curated facade, and assumed that was the entirety of the person. Silas, it seemed, had mastered the art of living a dual existence, a man who navigated two distinct realities with apparent ease. The mystery of Silas Blackwood had become a constant companion, a quiet hum beneath the predictable rhythm of my days. I found myself observing him with a new curiosity, a sharp awareness of the hidden currents that might lie beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. My own quiet life, once a source of solace, now felt a little less certain, a little more open to the unexpected. The widower next door, I now understood, was far more than he appeared, and the woman in the emerald green dress was the key to unlocking a secret world I was only just beginning to glimpse. The tapestry of his life, I suspected, was woven with far more vibrant threads than I had ever imagined. The image of Silas Blackwood, my quiet, unassuming neighbor, kissing that woman at the airport, had lodged itself in my mind like a shard of glass. It was sharp, unwelcome, and refused to be dislodged. The carefully constructed image of him, the grieving widower, the man who spoke of his late wife Eleanor with a hushed, understated tone, a man whose solitary existence seemed to mirror my own, had not just shattered. It had evaporated, leaving behind a bewildering void. My days, which had once been a quiet ballet of tending my rose bushes and meticulously polishing the beveled glass pane of my front door, now felt like a chaotic flux. Each morning, as I poured my Earl Grey, I found myself peering through the kitchen window, my gaze drawn to Silas's house. The curtains remained drawn, the porch light unlit, the meticulously manicured lawn undisturbed. It was as if the black SUV, the emerald green dress, and the passionate embrace had been a collective hallucination, a trick of the light, a figment of my lonely imagination. But the memory was too vivid, too visceral. The way his silver thatch had gleamed under the airport's artificial lights, the almost desperate possessiveness in his embrace, the sheer, unadulterated joy that seemed to emanate from them both. It was undeniable. Eleanor, the wife he'd mourned with such quiet dignity, the woman whose memory he invoked with a wistful sigh, seemed to recede further into the realm of fiction with every passing hour. The following week, a subtle shift occurred in the rhythm of our quiet street. The black SUV, a vehicle so out of place amongst the sensible sedans and minivans of our neighborhood, began to appear with more regularity. It would glide silently into Silas's driveway, often in the late afternoon, and remain for a few hours. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement through his living room window, a flash of color, a silhouette that was distinctly not Silas's usual stooped posture. I found myself fabricating reasons to be outside. I'd water the petunias with an almost aggressive fervor, dust the garden gnomes with an intensity that bordered on obsession, or simply sit on my porch swing, a cup of lukewarm tea growing cold in my hands, pretending to read a book whose words swam before my eyes. My focus, however, was invariably on Silas's house, a silent sentinel observing the unfolding mystery. One Tuesday afternoon, as I was carefully pruning a particularly unruly, rambling rose, the black SUV pulled into Silas's driveway. This time, however, the doors opened almost immediately. Silas emerged first, looking, different. He was dressed not in his usual tweed jacket and sensible trousers, but in a sharply tailored navy suit, the kind that spoke of confidence and occasion. He moved with a surprising lightness, a spring in his step that was entirely alien to the man I thought I knew. Then, the passenger door opened, and she stepped out. The woman from the airport. My breath hitched. Her emerald green dress shimmered even in the muted afternoon light, a siren call of vibrant color against the subdued tones of our street. She was striking, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon, her smile dazzling. She carried a small, chic handbag, and her movements were fluid, graceful, like a dancer. They stood for a moment on Silas's porch, not speaking, but their connection was palpable, a silent current that hummed between them. Then Silas reached out, his hand finding the small of her back, and he guided her inside. The door closed with a soft click, leaving me alone with my wilting roses and a heart that felt like it had been dropped from a great height. This wasn't just a casual acquaintance. This was something significant. The way he touched her, the way she leaned into him, it spoke of intimacy, of shared history, of a life lived together. My mind, so accustomed to the predictable patterns of grief and quiet solitude, struggled to reconcile this vibrant, passionate couple with the image of the man who had spoken so tenderly of Eleanor, the man who had seemed so utterly lost in his sorrow. The following days were a torment of speculation. Who was she? How long had this been going on? Had Silas lied to me? Or had I simply been too eager to accept the narrative he presented? The shared grief that had initially drawn me to him now felt like a carefully constructed deception. He hadn't been a fellow traveler in the landscape of loss. He had been an actor, playing a part with remarkable conviction. I found myself replaying every interaction we'd ever had. The times he'd offered to help me carry groceries, the brief chats over the fence, the shared moments of silence as we both tended our gardens. Had those moments been genuine, or merely a cover for his clandestine life? The thought pricked at me, a sharp sting of betrayal. Then an opportunity presented itself, an unexpected turn in the unfolding drama. I received a formal invitation, a wedding invitation to be precise. It was addressed to me, Mrs. Eleanor Gable, a small, cruel irony that made my hand tremble as I opened it, and it was for the marriage of Silas Blackwood to a Ms. Isabella Rossi. The date was set for 2 weeks hence, at a picturesque vineyard estate a few towns over. My initial reaction was a dizzying cocktail of shock, anger, and a strange, almost morbid curiosity. Silas Blackwood, the grieving widower, was getting married. And not just married, but marrying a woman with a name that sounded as exotic and vibrant as the emerald green dress. Isabella Rossi. It rolled off the tongue like a melody from a foreign film. The invitation itself was an ornate affair, printed on thick cream-colored cardstock, embossed with elegant gold lettering. It was a testament to a life of sophistication and celebration, a stark contrast to the quiet, understated existence I had believed Silas inhabited. My own wedding invitation to Arthur had been much simpler, a reflection of our unpretentious lives. I sat with the invitation for a long time, the weight of it in my hand mirroring the weight in my chest. I had to go. I needed to go. Not out of any lingering affection for Silas, but out of a need for closure, for understanding. I needed to see this woman, Isabella Rossi, with my own eyes. I needed to witness Silas Blackwood, the man I thought I knew, as he stepped fully into this new, vibrant reality. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of internal debate and practical preparation. I debated whether to wear black, a somber nod to my own widowhood and a silent acknowledgement of the deception, or something more neutral, a way to blend into the celebratory atmosphere without being a stark reminder of Silas's supposed grief. I settled on a deep sapphire blue, a color that felt regal yet understated, a compromise between my internal turmoil and the external demands of the occasion. I also found myself meticulously researching Isabella Rossi. A quick online search, fueled by a desperate need for answers, revealed a surprising amount. Isabella Rossi was a renowned concert pianist, known for her fiery performances and a life lived in the spotlight. Her public profile was filled with images of her gracing grand concert halls, her face alight with passion, her hands poised over a gleaming grand piano. There were articles detailing her